India, I would argue, has a very convenient position by positioning itself actually as a real geopolitical bridge builder between the two worlds. So practically what India is doing right now is taking the best from both worlds.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Today we're discussing an Indian Prime Minister's first visit to Austria after more than 4 decades. Glad to be joined online from Vienna again after a bit. Velina Tchakarova, a global strategist and founder of FACE. Thanks so much, Velina, for giving us time.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great being back on your show.
Veena, just looking at, after the much scrutinized Moscow summit between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi, which you were also, keeping a close eye on apart from the rest of the world, why do you think Prime Minister Modi actually chose to visit Austria?
There have been a lot of speculations, to be honest with you. Austrian journalists were asking the same question yesterday in various interviews. And of course, what I will offer you is just, my 2 cents, my kind of, let's say, speculation, as I don't have access to the decision-making process of Prime Minister Modi and his team. I think that it was a natural decision to make, given first and foremost the fact that the first official meeting, the first official visit took place in Moscow, and being in Europe and having the opportunity to actually, let's say, have a second leg of this trip, to pick Austria as first and foremost neutral country that was famous during the Cold War as not just neutral, but practically the meeting point of East and West, the two, fighting coalitions of the two superpowers at the time, having all these international organizations, which is also very important to think of the role of India last year, for instance, during the G20. And then, of course, also having the statements of the Austrian Chancellor in mind from the recent peace conference in Switzerland, organized on the topic of Ukraine and how to solve actually the how to find actually a long-lasting peace solution, where India was also presented. And then a final point, also knowing that Austria, is a European Union member. In that sense, is not politically neutral. That's sure. But it's militarily neutral. It's not a member of NATO, and at the same time, is still keeping quite strong economic ties with Russia. As we speak, for instance, the gas dependence on on Russia is almost 90%. And there are a lot of activities of Austrian companies and financial institutions in Russia. So all in all, I think these were the layers which played a role, in deciding, let's say, on this trip to Austria.
Right. We saw a lot of history being replayed in terms of both leaders talking about the venue itself of one of the meetings, of course, and history being talked about and how India possibly helped Austria get its independence with the then Soviet Union. But in more modern terms and in your strategic analysis, what really does Austria offer India today in the current geopolitical scenario?
Well, first and foremost, it's worth highlighting that India is probably the most efficient geopolitical and geoeconomic bridge builder between these two worlds, between these two systems, if you like, because in my personal view, we are already living in a Cold War 2.0 between the West on the one side, guided and led by the United States, and China together with Russia on the other side. So the dragon bear, as I've been pointing to for the last 10 years. And here we have a very specific role for India, because on the global scene, but also in various regional formats, India is increasingly playing a role, and it has the capacities, it has the geopolitical and the geoeconomic exposure and leverage to play this role. Now, if you compare with Austria, Austria has also expressed the wish to be a bridge builder, specifically here in Europe. Since the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine, it has, announced that it would like to play this role, to be a mediator in the conflict, to be a neutral playground for meetings, for talks, for negotiations. Nothing of that happened. But India, of course, is a very different scale. I would argue that given the trend projections when it comes to the economic portfolio and the trade portfolio, Prime Minister Modi promised, and I heard it myself when I was, one of these forums back in February in India, and I heard it myself when he said that he wants India to become world's economy number 3 during his third mandate. So you have the geoeconomic exposure. It's happening. Both the West and also China and Russia have to take a note, and they have to collaborate. But at the same time, you have the geopolitical exposure, and that is that India has a saying in all these relevant multipolar formats and conferences. And here, I think, Austria does realize that India in itself, the voice, but also India as an advocate for, let's say, the collective global South has to be regarded.
We've seen in terms of petroleum products that India gets from Russia at hugely discounted levels, and then some of it is given back to Europe. Was up last year and another 20% just in the first quarter. India is talking more energy with the Russians as well. But is there any way that Austria can be involved in the payment settlement mechanism that you were mentioning and have written about earlier?
Okay, so here we have a very, very big geoeconomic issue, being the fact that India will need fossil fuels. Yes, it will, of course, increase the share of renewables, will participate in all various initiatives when it comes to the energy transition. But for the time being, fossil fuels, specifically oil, gas, coal, but also nuclear energy, all of this is something that it can get from Russia. And we clearly saw the trend projection that it's not only about long-term deals when it comes to the oil supply from Russia, but also in the future, what I've been arguing already for quite some time now, there will be gas supply coming from Russia, mostly LNG. And then there is this important point linked to the development of the Northern Sea route, which is, in the Arctic, and it will facilitate not just the fossil fuel supply, but also the trade flows. And here, of course, there is a common interest. Obviously, on the Russian side, the interest is to diversify away from Europe, given the fact that now, as you mentioned, you have the sanctions, and you have the sanctions in the oil with the oil cap, price cap. In the gas sector, there are no sanctions, but there is this urge to reduce the gas supply. So one of the countries that is still very much dependent when it comes to gas supply is Austria, because Austria doesn't have access to LNG terminals. It hasn't built any interconnectors. It hasn't worked on long-term, let's say, long-term gas deals with third countries. And yes, and in that kind of context, the gas from Russia will be still flowing. So one of, I would argue, the points that hasn't been certainly discussed is the point about the financial transactions, because Russia is internationally isolated when it comes to Western financial mechanisms. Think of the SWIFT system. That led to the effect that huge, rupee portfolio has been stuck in Indian banks for the oil payments. And currently, given the fact that the Indian, Russian trade volume is projected to further grow in the next years, the two leaders have announced 100 billion US dollars target. A lot of this portfolio will be, the share will be based on, energy supply. Here, I think that India would be exploring ways how actually other countries that are currently in a similar situation are facilitating the financial transactions. Now, we know for a fact, because it was made public, that Austrian bank like Raiffeisen, which is still active in Russia, has paid more than 400 million in taxes last year in 2023. That means, of course, that it was part of the facilitation of the payments for the gas supply from Russia. And here, I think there will be some talks, obviously behind the curtains, closed door talks, how to explore, different financial mechanisms. And by the way, we actually saw in the press release in the meeting between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi that they are already looking and exploring looking for and exploring different options how to facilitate these payments.
Extremely significant and important point you're bringing up there, Velina. But again, I wanted to get your thoughts about both trips. Now, we saw what happened in Moscow, what the Prime Minister publicly remarked in front of President Putin. Subsequently, even in the one-on-one, at least in the press releases, that's what was said in terms of the war in Ukraine, how he was pained about innocent lives being lost, children being killed, and how the battlefield was not the solution to the problem. Peace and dialogue, again, reiterated when he was in Austria by both leaders. How do you view that dynamic, Velina?
Well, obviously, this is the most interesting geopolitical dynamic, because it's not in the Indian interest right now to actually face so many hotspots, military conflicts and wars around the globe, mostly because of the second order effects of the cascading negative effects coming from these wars and military conflicts in terms of inflation, in terms of weaponization of raw materials, be it energy supply or food commodities or even fertilizers. In the case of India, fertilizers are critically important for, the wheat production at home, but also for, obviously for, in general, to secure actually the food production and supply to the largest population of the world. So in a sense, that is the reality that I think Prime Minister Modi addressed by saying right from the beginning of the war that this is not an era for wars. But the sad reality at the same time is that, neither India nor even China, let's say the closest geopolitical partner of Russia right now in terms of comprehensive support for the war itself, but also for the Russian economy, trade, and so on and so forth. Or as NATO yesterday described it, the most comprehensive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. So even these two key partners of Russia will not be able to, let's say, exercise an influence on the Russian president to stop the war. So the war will end actually on Russian terms. And unfortunately, that is the reality. That is the reality on the battlegrounds, and that is the reality in geopolitical terms. And right now, from what I read, based on what's happening on the ground and based on what's happening in the geopolitical context, is that the Russian president has no interest in stopping the war, that he is convinced that he's on the winning side. The international isolation that the West sought against Russia is failing. The Western sanctions that have been introduced, meanwhile, 14 packages, are being bypassed by the Western countries themselves. And then even the third component of the Western approach, the third dimension, that is the comprehensive support for Ukraine, is shaking in a sense that it's too slow, too inconsistent. It happens, in stages, and that slows down also the Ukrainian counteroffensives and the Ukrainian response. So that is the reality. So long as this is the reality, I just don't see any geopolitical rationale for the Russian president to stop the war, unless there is a black swan event, like you have an unexpected event in the Kremlin, something huge happens, with the political establishment, which I think is highly unlikely, or on the international arena, where I would argue that Russia has solidified its positions within, the context of its two key partners, being China and India, but also within the global South, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And even in Europe, now we see, think of the visit of Prime Minister Orban, who went to Russia, then he went to China, and now he's meeting actually the presidential candidate Trump, not even briefing actually Biden, who went to the NATO summit to, really inaugurate the 75th anniversary, to brief on the so-called peace mission. So we will see a lot of peace missions. We will see a lot of efforts, and I understand the rationale behind the Indian statements. But in reality, up until this, rationale in terms of the Russian decision making is there, I just don't see any big shift or any big change. So the war is here to stay for at least the period of 2025, 2026.
Wow. And when you look at, when you analyze the Russian rationale, we were just seeing pictures of the NATO summit, which is currently on in Washington, D.C., that you were mentioning as well. But the Russian rationale, the words that have been coming out from the Kremlin, other officials, including deputy prime ministers, etc., on an escalation or a fear of escalation. Now, arms, there's talk about even more transfers of, say, F-16 aircraft from European countries to Ukraine. Is there a danger of a Russian escalation when you're reading their mindset?
Yes, now the big topic is, of course, the delivery of the F-16. And this is another example how long it takes, from the debate on the delivery of a certain military equipment or system to the, point where this is, happening. It took more than a year. Actually, if we consider the F-16s, the delivery of F-16s is by no means a game changer for this war. And what I meant by comprehensive military aid was actually introducing or launching, if you like, a war economy on the old continent to actually provide, consistent delivery of ammunition, air defense systems, all, drones, all of the necessary components of the Ukrainian defense. So this punctual, step by step, slow, inconsistent delivery of one or other. We had the same debate about the tanks, if you remember. Now we moved from the tanks to the delivery of military jets. Every time the same, the same debates at home, the same, political inconsistency, if you like, even political correctness, because a lot of elections took place in the meantime. At the same time, politicians in Europe are not, honest with their own population. They're not explaining that the devastating inflationary impact on European economies because of this war. I mean, this war is a systemic risk. This war is a systemic risk of a scale like the pandemic. So just for you to understand what's really happening on the ground, it destroys supply chains. It destroys actually secure supply of critical raw commodities, and so on and so forth. And the very fact that politicians, being raised and having the mindset of peace conditions and peace context were simply not up to the role of facing specifically the non-conventional part of the warfare, because let's be real about it. Russia intends not just to subjugate the second largest country in Europe for the sake of its own geopolitical rationale that goes beyond any NATO expansion, as it's been stating, or whatsoever. It's really about positioning in a new world, in a new reality, in a new geopolitical and geoeconomic reality as a great power. Yes, obviously not a superpower, but a new great power. And for that matter, it needs all of these things to happen. But next to the subjugation, Russia still seeks actually to fully reshape the security architecture in Europe, on the old continent, to impose its own rules of the game, to impose its own conditions and its own reading of, if you like, international law, international relations, and so on and so forth. And this is where, our European politicians are fully unprepared to face, the reality. And that is the non-conventional part of the warfare. Think of the weaponization of the raw materials, think of the nuclear blackmail, because you asked, what about the risk? What about the likelihood? No, the likelihood of a, let's say, nuclear exchange is still as low as it was, during the Cold War period and after the Cold War period. Yes, it is imminent, the risk is imminent, but the likelihood is pretty low that there will be a nuclear exchange. The same goes for a direct military conflict between Russia and NATO members, or Russia and the United States, or even, if you like, Russia, China, and United States. There won't be any direct military confrontation between these, nuclear powers. The same goes obviously also for the context of India and China, even though that the military tensions will, axiomatically increase with the growing portfolio of India around the world, the geopolitical and the geoeconomic portfolio, and with the troubles that China is facing at home and also around the world. But these two scenarios of, let's say, World War III or nuclear exchange are still very unlikely. But below the threshold of this, we are going to see the most volatile and the most dangerous time in terms of, rise of various negative trends for not just the Western economies, but actually for societies around the world, when it comes to, the effects, the cascading effects from these hotspots, because we do not talk about one war anymore. We talk about connected hotspots in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in the Red Sea, and now with the growing tensions also in the South China Sea and Strait of Taiwan.
From all those points that you brought up, Velina, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism in the West about the very much publicized hugs between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. But I wanted to get a little bit deeper into your thinking about the embrace between Russia and China. Where do you see that going? And how do you see India navigating this Russia-China triangle?
Yes, that's about the hugs. I mean, perception in geopolitics is actually very important, because perception of power is power that, reveals a certain layer. When we talk about hugs, I should remind, our audience that a lot of other Western decision makers were eager to hug Prime Minister Modi on, on equal terms. Let's be real about it. And they did have no problem with that. Now, there is no secret that the personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin is very good, so that there is a trust base. You can clearly see this from the footage. Similarly to actually the trust base and the personal relationship between President Putin and the Chinese, leader Xi Jinping. So there were also hugs, which was quite untypical for an Asian leader, as was discussed, the last time when they met. By the way, also, obviously, the first important official visit by Xi Jinping following the re-election of Putin. Now, coming back to the hugs part, I don't consider it being interesting. This is just for clickbaits and for media hype. But you simply cannot deny the reality, and that is that we are talking about three leaders who know each other very well, who have invested a lot in the build-up of the personal relationship. I mean, of course, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi. They have invested a lot in the personal relationship, specifically, of course, the two dimensions: China, Russia, and Russia, India. Not so much, of course, obviously, when it comes to India, China. This is a very different story, and now they are benefiting from it. I mean, now they can really build on a solid ground. And of course, a key word here is predictability in the relationship, which is very rare in a highly uncertain world of geopolitics, to decipher the intentions of your counterpart, to understand the mindset, and then to work on, let's say, point of intersections. That's very, very difficult. So here, this is, I would say, a bonus point, but by no means this is, let's say, the most important common denominator for overlapping national interests, because these relations are still, let's be clear about it, are still being shaped by three countries that have enough strategic autonomy in their decision making. That means to take decisions that are reflecting their own national interest. Now, coming back to the more important part, and that is how India is going to position itself in this, obviously growing modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia. First and foremost, right now, China and Russia have become the closest to each other in the history of their relationship. That's the reality, and a lot of it is due to the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin, due to the overlapping of their views on the world, on the international relations, and understanding of their countries. So it has been a top-down process for a very, very long time. And now it's becoming organic, because this modus vivendi of coordination is entailing more and more strategic domains. And because the transitionary period of international relations is becoming more volatile. So this is like a hedge for both of them to first and foremost avoid any big risks for political instability at home, but at the same time to avoid any risk of, let's say, unexpected threat coming from mostly the United States and the West. So that is very simply put. This is the reality. This is where the bilateral relationship is standing, and it is, I would argue, here to stay for at least, let's say, the next decade or even more, depending on the way how China will be managing its, let's say, various peaks. I do not mean only the demographic peak, but the economic peak, and so on and so forth, because this will be a period of instability, and it could turn China more assertive, but also more aggressive. Now, India, I would argue, has a very convenient position by positioning itself actually as a real geopolitical bridge builder between the two worlds. So practically what India is doing right now is taking the best from both worlds. It is deepening the relationship with Russia. I think this is the most, geopolitically speaking, the most adequate thing to do, as a liability against the possible aggressive, behavior of China, specifically in the region, of course, Central and South Asian terrain, the wider Eurasian terrain. At the same time, Russia is also interested in deepening the relationship with India for the sake of having a hedge, against the possibility of deterioration of the relations with China. So it's a insurance. It's a geopolitical insurance, but it's really based also, as I said, on much more than that. When it comes to the West, here once again, India, proves the readiness and the willingness, but also is having, fortunately, a very adequate, leadership that understands these dynamics. That the most, logical thing to do is just to have the strength, the military strength, the economic growth, and the positive demographic picture, really simply put, to not be necessarily facing a situation where you have to enter a strategic alliance with one or the other. So it's not going to be a non-alignment movement this time, but it's going to be more assertive, center of power, mostly regional center of power, engaging with the global South, engaging with the two, centrifugal forces, being United States and China, Russia by extension, and then trying, to as I said, to get to benefit from, non being aligned with any of these two, system rivals.
Velina Tchakarova, as always, is absolutely great and a great pleasure to have you on StratNews Global and enjoy all your strategic analysis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure's all ours. And a reminder to our viewers to follow our social media handles for the latest that we put up on articles on our website and interviews like this with Velina Tchakarova on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.